Welcome back, everyone, to our latest episode of Basement to Bedside, a podcast for HTM professionals diving into our field's hottest topics. I'm Danielle McGeary,
My name is Ryan Gonzalez.
and today we have Matt Baretich with us, a clinical engineer and forensic engineer. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you for having me, Danielle and Ryan. Glad to be here.
Glad
Oh,
to
we're
have you.
honored to have you. So let's get right to it in the interest of time. I did introduce you as being a forensic engineer in addition to a clinical engineer. Do you want to talk about some of the specifics of what a forensic engineer is for those who might not be as familiar with the career?
Right. Yeah. I think of forensic engineering that I do as just a part of my clinical engineering consulting practice. And so, what I do as part of that consulting work is help organizations like hospitals or other healthcare facilities deal with medical device related incidents. And we can talk a little more about exactly what that entails, but primarily it's situations where some sort of harm occurred and it may have been related to a medical device. And so the big picture of sorting that out is takes into account engineering as well as lots of other perspectives, the clinical perspective and other. It's a team sport in trying to achieve the overall objective, which is to manage that incident that occurred and long term to make it less likely to reoccur. Because, as I said, it started out with some kind of harm occurred. Unfortunately, sometimes it's a case where um, a patient gets hurt, and so obviously we want to make that less likely in the future. So I get brought into cases where typically where the just to put it bluntly, the organization gets sued. And so I work with risk management professionals, patient safety professionals, but also with attorneys in dealing with those cases. So, but I think what we're going to talk about today is not about those um, cases at that level so much as what does an in-house clinical engineer or biomedical equipment technician or other HTM professional need to do to be part of that team response for something that has happened in the organization. And it will happen someday in everyone's career. And because it's relatively rare, we don't get much practice doing that. So that's why I think it's worth chatting about the kinds of things that let us, the technical folks, be good contributors to how the organization manages those incidents.
Well, thank you for that, Matt. And from my experience within the hospital system, there's a number of different ways that HTM can get brought into these types of investigations. Sometimes they're the first person to get the phone call, and sometimes they're brought in by risk management. I would ask for your perspective, what are some good tips for anybody within HTM when they do get that first phone call that there's a potential patient safety incident with a piece of medical equipment?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's some things we could talk about, uh, that about. I'd say the most important thing is get there as quickly as possible, because evidence tends to disappear, people forget, that sort of thing. So the sooner you can show up and be there is going to be an important aspect of this. And it really brings a related question, which is how quickly do we learn about something? Too often it's, oh, days later we hear something about it, or device shows up in the shop and it says broke on it, and we don't realize somebody got hurt, and we just think it's a repair that we need to work on. So, what I really am trying to get to in my answer here is we need to build some preparation. And what I mean by that is get to know the risk management department and get to know the patient safety professionals in your organization. Develop a relationship, help out, tell them what you do, what resources you can bring, because I think the best situation is that when those other professionals recognize the need to bring HTM into the team, into the picture, they will think of you right away. So lay some groundwork and be ready to be called in, and then I think good instincts will kick in from that point. But we can talk about some specific steps as we go along today.
And that's such a great point, Matt. I often talk about being present in the hospital, getting out of the basement, making sure the clinical team and all the support services know who you are, because you become like an integrated web in the hospital system. And like you said, when something happens, you want them to be like, we need to call biomed or HTM. That's like one of their first thoughts, not that we're an afterthought. And that really comes down to the connections you make in the hospital and being present and active in different types of committees as well, beyond just break fix. So, let's fast forward. So we get the call. Hopefully it's right after the event happened. We'll back it up there. Not that we heard about it weeks later. What what advice would you give to those HTM professionals that are quickly going up to the room and it might be their first time dealing with this type of situation?
Again, we're talking about serious incidents. So somebody, let's just imagine the situation is somebody got hurt, a patient got hurt, or we think they might have gotten hurt by a medical device. So you've got a lot of people who are at a long way from their best moments. They may have been the people that might have contributed to the incident. They're people who are worried about their patients. They may still be struggling to deal with the impact. The first thing that the patient care providers need to do is ignore the machine and go take care of the patient. So that's the mode that they are in. So we need to have sort of a balance of being there and being involved, but not being intrusive, and also being sensitive to the difficulty of the situation. But keeping that in mind, I think it's important to think what we're there for is to collect information. We want obviously we're going to start thinking, how the heck could that have happened, and how could that typical failure of this particular device have contributed to the events that occurred. I mean, that's the technical part that we bring to the table. And so start looking for the information. What's going on in the room, what are people saying, what information can you collect at the site, and be respectful in collecting that information, but this is the golden time when you can learn a lot about what happened. I'll add one more thing. In addition to bringing our technical knowledge into that situation, the other thing we do is we have sort of a broad perspective. I've found in my work that it's actually not often that it's the medical device that failed. Sometimes it is, and you have to certainly take into account the possibility of technical failures, but it's more often, how was it the right device for that application? Was it set up properly? Did people know how to do it? What was the environment? Was a infusion pump misprogrammed in the middle of the night when it was dark and people couldn't see? So understanding the context in which technology gets used is the other real strong point that we can bring to the situation.
That's a good point because I've been involved in a few incident investigations in my career, and oftentimes what that looked like was us pulling or getting the equipment and having to pull event logs or alarm logs, and then giving some professional advice on here's what we think happened without maybe adding blame or saying for certain this is what happened. Besides those couple things, are there anything else you think we should be maybe paying attention to? I know one thing I hear mentioned a lot is sequestering the device and any sets or disposables. Anything else we can think of in terms of how we can collect that kind of information?
Sequester the device and which means ideally, number one, take it out of service, put it somewhere where it's not going to get put back into service. Maybe in real serious cases, lock it up in the risk management department and put some signage on it. Plug it in because some of those alert and event logs are um, depend on battery backup, and so you want to make sure that you don't lose that information. Some of these cases, when they're a legal case, can last months or years. So running the battery down is a real possibility over time. But putting it aside and collecting not just the machine, but to the extent you can, collecting the disposables. For example, in infusion pump incidents, one of the big problems is that the infusion sets have problems with them. And so if you can get that, that's important. If you can get the packaging so that you can get a lot number off of the disposable, any sort of thing like that. Paper that's available. I've rescued notes out of a wastebasket from put your gloves on first, but go in there and get that out because lots of times these scraps of information, as it seems to us, to some people, can be important down the road.
And how soon do you, obviously, the first thing you need to do is make sure that the patient's okay, and clinically they need to do what they need to do. But when you do like your investigations of talking to people, do you recommend doing that immediately after so information is still fresh in their head? Like, what is your next step after you've collected all of the information and physical evidence?
Yeah, I think you can ask a few things at that moment, but again, taking into account that people are probably not in the best frame of mind for dealing with that kind of thing. They're worried about the patient. They're worried about their responsibility for having patient harm, for example. But to get some of the basics, and then I think you can do the more in-depth interviews in a later follow-up. And I would recommend where you can to do that with somebody from risk management or patient safety so that you've got some guidance because those people deal with these situations all the time. And so again, since we don't do this a lot, um, just being there and sensitive to people who have more experience in those settings, I think would be helpful.
What are your thoughts on this common scenario that tends to happen with medical equipment where maybe we don't have access to pull the logs or we've investigated it and we can't figure out what anything wrong with it? What are your thoughts on involving the OEM in these sort of incident investigations, either because of need or because you as a clinical engineering haven't been able to figure out why it failed?
Yeah, that's an important question because many times with more complicated devices, certainly we don't have the intimate knowledge. We as hospital employees may not have the intimate knowledge. So at some point we've got to consult with the manufacturer or somebody with particular expertise in that area. My experience is that by and large, the manufacturers they are acting in good faith. But I think it's important to keep in mind that their incentives are not the same as ours. And so, particularly if you expect this is going to result in a lawsuit, I think that it's important to um, manage that access. So I've seen cases where something goes wrong and the manufacturer's rep just happens to be in the OR and comes over and said, "Oh, give that to me, I'll take care of it," and walks out the door with it. That's not something I would let happen. Down the road, I mean, you can certainly have some conversations which you would take good notes about. But what I have found that works in some cases is to set up a time to do the testing, preferably in my shop. First, develop a test protocol with the manufacturer, and then invite them in and take lots of pictures and maybe take videos and have whatever representatives need to be in the case in present at that moment so that everybody knows everything that everybody else knows. And so that's a way to get that kind of expertise, to pull in the manufacturer's expertise. I've also had a couple of cases where, on behalf of the hospital, I traveled to the manufacturer's laboratory because they have special equipment, and so would be there and be the observer, so that that information can be brought into court if it comes to that.
And you made a good point about, the OR rep taking the device, when you've been called in and realize that the OR rep from a company has done that. So let me segue for a second here. So you come in at a more higher level after the event's already happened. Maybe there's a litigation going on and you're being called in as like an expert witness, like a subject matter expert. So people like Ryan and I, who are boots on the ground, would have already done our investigation. What have you seen being called in that you either wish people like Ryan and I would have done, or things maybe Ryan or I would have done? You'd be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they would have actually done that on the ground. Like, what tips would you have for people out there that they should or shouldn't be doing from your experience?
Well, I think that, I just reiterate something I said earlier, which is important to collect the information and the disposables and the lot numbers and the packaging and all that stuff as much as you can. And nowadays so many medical devices are networked, so a bunch of information is not only in the box itself in some kind of an event log, but it's also gone to the electronic health record. And so, starting to retrieve that. So just be creative about the kinds of information that you can, that is out there. So we don't have to collect every scrap of, clinical impressions. I mean, we're not clinical experts ourselves. So there'll be risk management people who will talk more closely one-on-one with nursing, for example. But we need to be creative, I think, on where is the technical information that we're going to rely on to try to sort things out after the fact.
So I have a question from my experience that I'm curious to get your opinion on. You mentioned, doing testing and investigation. So pulling from the IV pump example, you've used it a couple times. So I've had in the past where the IV pump over infused and they want me to test not just the IV pump, but the actual set that the patient used to see, did this disposable set deliver accurately? Is that something that you would think would be appropriate, or something maybe from a clinical engineering perspective we should push back on, or wait for further expertise? Or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it depends in to some extent. For example, if we know it's going to be a lawsuit, then I would be hesitant to start making changes. For example, put the infusion set back in the pump and run it a while, because in a sense you've destroyed the evidence. At least you've destroyed the circumstances that it was found in. I find, for example, a common thing with infusion pumps is when you've got a primary and secondary infusion going on, where instead of going into the patient, it goes back into the other bag. And so you can observe that, if you can sometimes see that the the medication has gone the wrong direction. People ask me for a policy about how to do all this, and I'm always reluctant. The answer I give them, because they really do want some kind of policy in front of them, is the Veterans Administration has a real good guidebook. And I think it's available on the ACCE website. And I'm sure they would share it with the AMI website as well if it's not already the case. So that's a good guide. Um, what I find is each case is so different, it's hard to know. It's hard to just follow an algorithm and say, do this or do that. So
Yeah.
I think it's a professional judgment value to say, we want to collect information, but we don't want to tamper with the information that's available. So I realize I'm not giving you a pat answer to that, but
No,
that's
but I
the
think
kind
it's a
of
good
things
one.
that you would
Yeah.
think about.
It's a really good thing to think about though, because you got to realize, and sometimes trying to do good, you're actually doing harm. Like by trying to do more investigation, you're now tampering with evidence. And I think it's something that folks should be aware of. But, to wrap this all up, why do you have like what is the most interesting case you've ever been called into to investigate? And what did you learn from it? Keeping it anonymous, of course. Please don't tell us the people or the health systems or anything like that.
There was a surgical case that was underway. The patient had been anesthetized and the surgery was getting started. The patient was on an OR table. And at one point, the surgeon asked the nurse anesthetist at the patient's head, who had the control pendant for the table, to make a little adjustment. And she did that. And then the table kept moving. And what happened was that the foot of the table folded all the way up to the mechanical stop, and the head folded up all the way to the mechanical stop, and the bed tilted over to the side. And of course, the surgeon said, "Stop moving the bed. This is not what I want this to be happening." And the nurse anesthetist said, "I'm not. I'm not telling it to move." And so the things that followed very quickly were, one, appropriately, the OR staff dealt with the patient to try to get the patient safe, with some success and some lack of success. And the nurse anesthetist got down on her hands and knees and traced the power cord from the OR table over to the wall and pulled the plug out, which did not stop it from moving because they are battery powered so that they can be repositioned even when when they're not plugged in, and was stuck there and went to the override controls, tried to adjust them, and couldn't stop it from moving. And so what it ended up being was a long series of tests with an elaborate test protocol with like four different parties. And so I'll just paint the scene briefly. When we were doing this couple of several hour long investigations, so there were all of us engineers kneeling around on the floor and following the protocol. And the protocol would say, "Okay, next, take out these four screws." And we would look at each other, should we take out the four screws? And we'd say, "Okay." Then we would turn around to the attorneys and say, "Okay to go to the next step." And they would put down their cell phones and say, "Okay, you can go to the next step." So really slow, lots of photography, lots of videography going on, and step by step we took the table apart and looked for things like why was there not an override switch? Why could the switch, what part failed? What override capabilities no longer work? What was the training that people had? What was the manufacturer support like? So there are a whole raft of things that had to be sorted out to try to figure out what in the world went on in that case. And tell one more step. I mean, there were many hours of doing that, and then there were follow-up depositions with attorneys. And interestingly, this one never went to trial. And that turns out to be the case, that it's relatively rare that these cases ever go to trial. Typically, there's this long process of discovery and depositions, and at the end, everybody puts everything on the table, and the attorneys cut a deal and don't go to court and don't roll the dice with the jury. So this had a lot of interesting cases. You can invite me back sometime, and I'll give you the long version of that story with many pictures. But that was the most interesting thing, I think, that came up. Now I can see on the screen Ryan and Danielle, being HTM professionals, are thinking, how did that happen? And where did that go wrong? And that's exactly the strength that we bring to the table. We're often running thinking, what the heck went wrong here?
And are you going to tell us what happened to the table? Like what caused it? Or
Yeah,
are you
don't
going to
leave
leave
us
us
hanging.
Yeah, you're going to leave us hanging. We have to like do a part two of this.
Well, so number one, there was not a single root cause, which
Got
is
it.
usually the case. But one of the main things is that there was a retrofitted by the manufacturer, retrofitted heavy piece of sheet metal inside the column of the table that had gotten pushed out of place. We don't know how. And so when the table was dropped, that heavy sheet metal bumped up against some physical switches and broke them, and
Oh my
broke them in
goodness.
such a way that the switch then was effectively calling for those motions, this folding and this folding and this tipping. And so the bed did what it was told by those switches. But
Holy cow.
Yeah.
so uh, fascinating, lots and lots of things to think about.
Well, that was really fascinating. And Matt, we feel so fortunate to have you today on the show to share your wealth of knowledge. This is such an important topic for HTM professionals because, you know, you should never be planning for the emergency in the emergency. You need to know how to at least somewhat rudimentarily respond, even though every day is different. And I think just having you here to have people think about this that have never been called into these scenarios is so valuable. So thank you so much for your time today and being here on Basement to Bedside with Ryan and me.
Yeah. Thank
Glad
you,
to be
Matt.
here. Thank you.